Good evening and a warm welcome to all for the monthly clinical meeting of the Association of Obs and Gynae of Delhi, organized virtually by Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology, UCMS and GTB Hospital, New Delhi. On behalf of Jacksonpal Pharmaceuticals Limited, makers of Doxipal DRL capsules containing doxycycline 100 mg with lactobacillus lycorate sachet of L-arginine, DHA and lycopene, and progesterone sustained release tablets as Divagest SR 200 and 300. I am Dr. Vipin Tyagi along with my teammates Dr. Deepika Chhabra and Mr. Amit Saxena. We welcome and thank HOD Department of Obs and Gynae, UCMS and GTB Hospital, Dr. Amita Suneja, for this opportunity to host the meeting. We are sure the cases to be discussed will throw light in management of rare gynecological complications. Welcome to all faculty, AOGD members and attendees from across India and abroad who have joined us today. Please keep posting your queries by text in the Q&A box which will be answered at the end of the session. Please note this webinar is brought to you as knowledge sharing initiative by Jackson Paul Medical Services and this session is streaming on Facebook Live. The recording will remain on Jackson Paul's YouTube channel for reference and promotion. We begin the proceedings with the AOGD President's address. Over to you, Dr. Mala Srivastava.
Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure and privilege to again conduct and be part with Dr. Amita Suneja in conducting this monthly meeting from GTB and UCMS Hospital. With all the precautions, we had first hybrid executive meeting at the auditorium of Gangaram Hospital, and it was a very successful hybrid executive meet. We were so excited to see our patrons like Dr. S.N. Mukherjee, Dr. Kamal Bakshi, Dr. Swaraj Batra, Dr. Neera Agarwal, Dr. Reva Tripathi, and Madam Dr. Amita Suneja was also there. And we were so happy to see everyone, all our seniors around us. And we also remembered last year we came physically to GTB Hospital. And it was a real such an experience with us because it was raining cats and dogs. And we really enjoyed the ambience, and we also took the pleasure of taking the lift from Madam Dr. Amita, and Madam dropped us at a residence. It was raining so heavily. So we have nice cases lined up for today's evening. I just wanted to make one announcement that Foxy has initiated cervical cancer and breast cancer screening module for International Women's Day on the 8th March 2021. We request all our members to screen at least 10 women on that day, either in your hospital facility, private or government, or in your private clinic, as many as possible. So that the mission of Foxy to screen as many women on that particular day is accomplished with the help of all our members. AOGD is the largest society of Foxy, so we must prove that when a society like AOGD works together, it can achieve anything. Our mission of AOGD as well as Foxy is women's health, and we are all for it, for the benefit of the health of a woman. We have forwarded the letter from the Foxy to all our members and will be happy if everyone contributes even partially to it. Without wasting time, we want to hand over the floor. So Dr. Mamta, you can give the secretary's report.
On behalf of AOGD, I welcome you all to this AOGD monthly clinical meeting being organized by Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology, UCMS and GTB Hospital. And I shall be presenting the secretary's report. We had our last AOGD monthly clinical meeting on 29th January, organized by Atal Bihari Vajpayee Institute of Medical Sciences and RML Hospital. And on 18th February, there was a hybrid executive committee meeting, which was organized at Sir Gangaram Hospital. A lot of events were organized virtually under the aegis of AOGD in the month of February, as you see the list here. And like as on 1st February, there were FAQs on diabetes in pregnancy under aegis of AOGD. On 2nd February, there was a webinar on recurrent hydrops fetalis under the aegis of Fetal Medicine and Safe Motherhood Subcommittee of AOGD. From 5th to 7th February, on 3 days, there were virtual Gurukul classes being organized by Institute of Obs and Gynae, Gangaram Hospital. And this was under the aegis of ISOPAB and AOGD. On 6th February, there was e-workshop on hypertensive disorder of pregnancy organized by DGF Southwest and Safe Motherhood Committee. On 19th February, this was talk on FAQs on menopausal medicine. On 13th February, there was a webinar on thyroid and menopause and GDM management organized by Reproductive Endocrinology Committee of AOGD. On 13th February, a webinar on update on threatened miscarriage was organized under the aegis of AOGD, NARCHI and ISCCP by FOGST. And on 17th February, the talk on FAQs and fibroid uterus was organized. On 17th February, this virtual workshop on fetal autopsy, unraveling the mystery, organized by Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology and Department of Anatomy, Maulana Azad Medical College. And this was under the aegis of NARCHI and AOGD and Fetal Medicine Subcommittee. On 17th February, a webinar on AOB was organized by AOGD Infertility Committee. On 21st February, CME on emergencies in clinical obstetrics was organized by Department of Obs and Gynae, ESI, Basai Darapur, under the aegis of Safe Motherhood Committee of AOGD and NARCHI. So on 22nd February, ECME on threatened miscarriage and recurrent pregnancy loss was organized by Reproductive Endocrinology Committee. On 25th February, FAQs on cervical cancer was organized. These are the forthcoming events which are lined up for the month. And on 27th February, tomorrow, we have CME on women's health organized by Gangaram Hospital. On 27th February, webinar on breast and cervical cancer prevention will be organized by the Breast and Cervical Cancer Prevention Committee of AOGD. On 3rd March, virtual quiz on critical care and obstetric will be organized by Institute of Obs and Gynae, Sir Gangaram Hospital. On 5th March will be FAQs on multi-micronutrients in pregnancy. On 6th March, webinar on providing quality care in abdominal malformations before, during, and after birth will be organized by the Fetal Medicine Committee and Quality Improvement Committee of AOGD. On 9th March will be FAQs on ovulation induction. On 16th March, FAQs on female sexual disorders. On 18th March, FAQs on HIV in pregnancy. And on 25th March, FAQs on care of pregnant women will be organized. And we have our next monthly clinical meeting on 26th March, which will be organized by Lady Hardinge Medical College. And thank you. I hand over to now Dr. Amita Suneja for further proceedings of the day.
Thank you, Dr. Mamta. And at the outset, I must thank AOGD team, Dr. Mala, and for your wonderful year. Last meeting, I distinctly remember that was the last physical meeting. Rather, after that, we were in the grip of Corona and all virtual meetings happened. And so my thanks to the Jackson Pal also for providing the IT platform. And so for today's, it's my proud privilege to welcome everyone, respected seniors, respected judges, dear colleagues, for the clinical monthly meeting hosted by UCMS and GTB Hospital. And you all know that last year we were made only COVID hospital along with LNGP. And so two of the presentations, today we have 4 scientific deliberations and 2 are related to COVID. I know that many presentations have been made on COVID by the previous clinical meetings from LNJP, Safdarjung, and other institutions. But we have taken the different aspect of COVID so that there's no overlap between the presentations. So the first on the COVID, Dr. Bindia will be presenting the effect on gynec oncology patients of COVID pandemic. And you know, every day during the COVID time was a challenging day, and every new case brought a new dilemma. So there were many unusual behavior of COVID, so we thought we'll present that in cases of near-miss mortality and the maternal mortality. Dr. Rashmi Malik will be presenting that data, the case series about idiosyncrasies of COVID pandemic virus. And 2 interesting cases we have added so that from the pre-COVID time. And one is very interesting, that the life-threatening complication resulting from a life-saving procedure in cases of PPH by the compression suture. And last case is a very short, crisp, and it is to add flavor to the meeting. So that will be presented by I think the third presentation will be Dr. Archana, and the last will be by the senior resident Preeti and consultant Dr. Richa Agarwal. So over to first presenter, Dr. Bindya. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So good evening, everybody, and respected seniors, my dear colleagues and my dear friends. So today I'm going to talk on a very important topic, that is an impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the gynecological cancer care delivery, our own hospital experience, as the GTB experience. As we all know that the COVID-19 pandemic has gravely wounded the world economy, the health systems, and with serious consequences impacting all the communities and all individuals. So what is the impact of this on cancer care delivery? Now, from a global collaborative study across 6 continents from 54 countries, 356 centers participated in a survey, and they found that 88% reported facing challenges in delivering care during this pandemic. Out of this, around half of them had already reduced services as a part of a preemptive strategy, but 1/5 of them complained of overwhelmed systems, then lack of personal protective equipment, staff shortage, and 10% also complained of restricted access to medication. So the major impact was almost 40% of the patients were exposed to harm from interruption of cancer-specific care, and the impact was more pronounced in LMICs. The similar results were also given in a survey which was done by the Association of Gynae Oncologists of India. They also said that in about the survey, 90 practitioners responded, and they said that the results of the study showed that the ongoing pandemic had severely affected gynecological oncology practices and care among all respondents. They had to modify diagnostic pathways, interventions, and follow-ups. Also, there was a near unanimous opinion that general safety measures were used by most of them, and there were mixed responses to the alternative educational activities, especially during using the electronic technology and distant learning methods. So now what happened in our hospital? As we all know, last year the national lockdown was announced on 25th of March, and simultaneously in our hospital from the 20th of March, all elective surgeries were suspended, and on 22nd of June, GTB Hospital was declared as a designated COVID hospital. Throughout the last year, we were handling only COVID. And on 15th of January, as the statistics went down, the government declared that now we can have partial resumption of services, non-COVID services. And finally, on the 5th of February, the hospital was declared as non-COVID, and we could resume our normal services gradually. Now, what happened to another hospital, that is Delhi State Cancer Institute, which is in our campus, which handles the chemoradiation load of our patients. There also, it was shut down, and only on June 2020, they partially resumed their OPD oncology services, started their limited chemotherapy and radiation services from the 15th of June, and partially resumed their surgical activities from November 20. So what was a major roadblock? For the roadblock was we could not deliver care at all to the non-COVID patients because we were a designated COVID hospital. And as Madam said earlier, that both tertiary hospitals of NCT, that is GTB and LNJP, were COVID. And but the few patients who came in contact with us, we referred them to Safdarjung and AIIMS to tackle the oncology services. And DSA, as I said, mentioned earlier, had restricted chemo and radiation services. So we thought we had to analyze the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on gynecological cancer care delivery at University College of Medical Sciences and GTB Hospital during the pandemic. So for this, what we did was we analyzed the records of new patients who were enrolled for gynae oncology care between January to March 2020. That was just 2.5 months before the lockdown. These records were retrieved from our oncology registers, and the pre-cancers were excluded. So 36 records were retrieved from the oncology registered, out of which there were 28 complete entries. 8 were incomplete entries, and they were excluded from the analysis. This was because either the patient's phone numbers were not available or they had changed. So out of these 28 entries, we then telephonically contacted them in January 2021, because as I said, we resumed our services and hence we resumed our tumor boards. So we thought we should now go back and see what has happened with the patients. So out of those 28 patients, 24 were alive and 4 had died. One was a CA vulva. She died because of COVID-19. There were 2 cancer ovary, which were both of them were stage 3 germ cell tumors. Unfortunately, they had not been able to complete or receive the adjuvant chemotherapy. And one was a cancer cervix. She could complete her treatment. However, she had a sudden cardiac death. And so all these 4 were excluded from the analysis. So out of these 4 patients who were available to us, so 9 were cancer cervix, 12 were cancer ovaries, 6 were CA endometrium, and 1 was cancer vulva out of these 28 patients. Now coming to specific cancers, out of those 9 patients of CA cervix, 2 underwent surgery. And out of these 2, none of them had required adjuvant chemotherapy. Hence, they were not supposed to go for chemoradiation. However, throughout the whole year, they could not report for follow-up. And then out of those 9, 7 patients had chemoradiation and 1 could complete the treatment. However, 6 had either partial treatment or interrupted treatment. There were 6 patients of CA endometrium. All the 6 were operated in the 3 months from January to March. And out of these 6 patients, 2 patients did not require any adjuvant treatment. However, they could not come for follow-up because of the COVID. And 1 patient had a partial adjuvant radiotherapy, and she could only receive EBRT. VBT could not be given in this patient. And 3 patients could not receive adjuvant treatment. And these three patients were either the high intermediate risk or the high risk patients. And so they were incompletely treated. There were 12 patients of cancer ovary, out of which 11 underwent surgery, while 1 patient was given NACT. The patient who was given neoadjuvant chemotherapy, again, had completed the neoadjuvant chemotherapy from February to November 2020, but could not be operated because of lack of surgical services. The 11 patients who were operated were as follows. Out of them 11, 3 did not require any adjuvant chemotherapy because out of them 2 were borderline and 1 was low-grade serous cancer. However, they could not report for follow-up because the hospital was closed. Then 3 women received chemotherapy outside, 1 in AIIMS and 2 in the private sector. Now 3 women could not receive adjuvant chemotherapy, and out of them 2 were a high-grade serous ovarian cancer and 1 was a germ cell tumor, and unfortunately this patient had passed away. Then 1 high-grade serous ovarian cancer and 1 germ cell tumor had interrupted adjuvant chemotherapy. They only received 1 cycle of adjuvant chemotherapy. This was before the lockdown. And unfortunately, again, we lost this patient of the stage 3 germ cell tumor. So out of all these 28 patients, treatment was completed in just 18%. Well, as you can see, there was a whole lot of 82% who either had partial treatment, incomplete treatment, or did not come for follow-up. So follow-up was delayed in 25%. There was incomplete treatment that they had not received adjuvant treatment in 22%, while treatment was interrupted or was partial in approximately 36%. But this is just the tip of an iceberg. The screening services have been suspended almost for a year because we were COVID, all the OPDs were stopped. There was no follow-up patients who were treated for pre-invasive cancer. And as I said, there were 8 missing entries and also incomplete records. And we have not counted the women who were already getting worked up in the OPD and they could not be entered in the oncology register. So do we learn something from this experience, and how can we wise? Because, in times to come, we will be having such situations now and then. So in a very beautiful article, was published in Lancet Oncology in 2021 only, certain lessons could be learned on how the NHS handled this emergency, especially oncology services in the crisis last year. They had declared that oncology services should be a part of emergency care. And they did they encouraged public-private partnerships during this time. So the entire NHS load was transferred to a private hospital, which was turned into an oncology center, and all the patients were treated free of cost with all the NHS benefits, and NHS paid for the entire thing, so that oncology services never got disrupted. So in the end, I would like to say that with us being a government hospital, we suffered a lot. 80% of OncoCare's services were impacted. So what do we do now? So the lessons we learned were that what we can propose is that while assigning the hospital for COVID care, provision should be made to arrange for proper treatment for other emergent diseases like cardiac, oncology, etc. There should be an implementation of an effective centrally coordinated response. There could be a team effort that we can collaborate with other institutes who are partially functioning, and we could then transfer our oncology services to them. Also, there's a strong need for centers of excellence in oncocare, which should keep functioning in calamities like this. Thank you very much for patient hearing.
I think questions will be asked at the end. So I can invite the next speaker, Dr. Archana. And this will be the case presentation.
Good evening, everyone. I'll be presenting a case of rare life-threatening complication. So it's a rare life-threatening complication of a common life-saving procedure. This 20-year-old lady, Para 3 Life 3, was referred to our hospital on post-operative day 3 with severe anemia, with multi-organ dysfunction, with query septicemia and uterine collection. LSCS was done in a nearby secondary care hospital for obstructed labor with meconium stain lichen. Operatively, she developed atonic PPH, which was managed by uterotonics, bilateral uterine artery ligation, and B-Lynch compression sutures. She developed severe bronchospasm secondary to injection carboprost on an OT table, which was managed by injection aminophylline, and patient was shifted to ICU for observation. On day 2 of the surgery, she developed abdominal distension, which increased subsequently along with rise in the fundal height of the uterus up to 32-week size. She became pale and her GC deteriorated, and hence she was referred to our hospital for further management. On admission to our hospital, she was conscious, oriented. Pulse rate was 130 beats per minute, BP 110/80. She was tachypnic with a respiratory rate of 30. Although she was maintaining saturation on room air, pallor corresponded to 6 gram%. She had basal crepitations in the left lung. The abdomen was grossly distended. Uterine height corresponded to 32 weeks. Uterus was deviated to right side with marked tenderness. Dressing was dry. Drain contained only 50 ml of serosanguinous fluid, and bowel sounds were absent. Cervix could not be visualized on speculum examination, although there was no active bleeding. On pervaginal examination, cervix was pulled up. It was felt with difficulty, and uterus was enlarged up to 32-week size and was extremely tender. An emergency ultrasound revealed multiple intramyometrial hematomas, largest one localized in the left-sided myometrium. The endometrial cavity was empty, with minimal free fluid in the peritoneal cavity. The emergency investigations revealed a low hemoglobin of 5.7 gram%. Rest of the investigations were within normal limit. So we decided to take this patient in emergency OT for an exploratory laparotomy in view of uterine hematomas and with a clinical suspicion of extension of hematoma to the broad ligament. Consent for peripartum hysterectomy was taken. Adequate blood and blood products were arranged. The peroperative, we entered the abdomen through a midline vertical incision, and the uterus was grossly enlarged both in the longitudinal as well as the transverse dimension as visualized in this picture. It was congested, flabby, bluish black in color. B-Lynch sutures taken by Vicryl were in situ, and the uterus was distended in between the compression sutures, giving it a lobulated appearance. Sutures at the caesarean stitch line had cut through the myometrium, and dark colored blood was oozing out. Another circumferential stitch was seen at the level of the internal os, encircling both the round and the infundibulopelvic ligaments. This was the location. I would like to just zoom in and show you. Yeah. So I think one can now appreciate this suture of Vicryl at the level of internal os pointed out by the artery fossa. This was the suture which was taken. Along with the uterus, both ovaries were also congested, bluish black, and appeared to be necrosed. The ovarian tissue was very friable. It was like coming in our hands. So a decision for abdominal hysterectomy with bilateral salpingo-oophorectomy was taken. And on cut section of the uterus, decidua was necrosed, myometrium was edematous, thickened, and filled with blood clots. Her post-operative period was equally exhaustive with lots of ups and downs. We transfused 3 units of RCC and 2 units of platelets to build her up. She developed fever and cough on day 3. Cultures were sent and broad spectrum antibiotics were started. On evaluating her for her cough and dyspnea, she was diagnosed to be a case of rheumatic heart disease with moderate mitral stenosis, mild MR, pericardial and pleural effusion. We took a cardiology opinion and she responded well to the medication started by the cardiologist. Blood and urine cultures came out to be sterile. But the decidual culture which we had sent from OT was positive for methicillin-resistant Staph aureus sensitive to teicoplanin. She responded well to teicoplanin. Her general condition improved, but she developed burst abdomen. It was managed by daily dressings and resuturing later on. She finally was discharged from our hospital after 1 month in a healthy condition and was advised to follow up in the GB Pant Hospital for her cardiac problems. But unfortunately, she lost to our follow-up after a single visit in OPD later on. On histopathology, uterus, bilateral ovaries, and fallopian tubes showed marked congestion and hemorrhage with only scant viable tissue identifiable. In this cut section from uterus, there is this large area of necrosis. This is hemorrhage, and few congested vessels were also noticed. This is a cut section from ovary where most of the areas had necrosis, hemorrhage, and at the periphery, there is infiltration of inflammatory cells. So the findings were suggestive of gross necrosis. So we made a final diagnosis of complete uterovarian necrosis following uterine compression, sutures leading to hysterectomy with bilateral salpingo-oophorectomy. Coming to discussion and review of literature, PPH is still the major cause of maternal morbidity and mortality and can turn into an obstetrician's nightmare anytime. Among the various uterine conserving techniques to control atonic postpartum hemorrhage, uterine compression sutures are commonly practiced by all of us. The concept was pioneered by B. Lynch et al. Way back in 1997. And after that, different techniques and modifications were also published with added advantages over B. Lynch sutures. The underlying principle is mechanical compression of the uterine vascular sinuses without occluding the uterine artery and uterine cavity so that uterine tone can be maintained until involution starts. So B. Lynch introduced this technique of belt and brace suture to control atonic PPH in a uterus with a hysterotomy. Later, Heymans introduced this technique of vertical sutures, longitudinal sutures in an atonic uterus without hysterotomy or with hysterotomy. These were the other variations introduced by various authors to prevent the slipping off of the longitudinal sutures in B. Lynch and Heymans. Pereira introduced this concept of global compression by a series of transverse and longitudinal sutures. Cho introduced this concept of square sutures, especially to arrest the local hemorrhage in lower uterine segment in cases of placenta previa and accreta. And Yano also introduced a modification of the vertical sutures by introducing these transverse suture to prevent sliding off or sliding in of the longitudinal sutures. So this is a comparison of the various case series published by different compression sutures, authors of different compression sutures, where they claim the success rate to be varying between 76% to 100%. In except B. Lynch and Pereira, most of the sutures, rather all of the sutures require transfixation of the anterior and posterior uterine walls. Still, the evidence for efficiency and safety of uterine compression sutures is weak because the data is limited by case series reported by the proponents themselves. No RCTs or even control trials are available in literature to compare one method to other, and even long-term follow-up information is lacking, especially for subsequent pregnancy outcomes. Similarly, the data on short and long-term complications is provided by isolated case reports and case series. The various complications reported so far in literature are uterine ischemia and necrosis, as was seen in our case, hematometra and pyometra due to occlusion of the drainage of lochia, synechia leading to amenorrhea and infertility, especially in cases where the compression sutures have opposed the anterior and the posterior walls, and even adverse outcome in subsequent pregnancy in the form of rupture uterus. This is a tabular representation of the various case reports which we could find in literature till now, which required hysterectomy for partial or complete necrosis. We could find 12 such case reports till now. And the first case was reported around 6 to 7 years after the introduction of D-Lynch sutures from India, where they had to take the patient for hysterectomy in view of partial necrosis within 24 hours. And as can be analyzed from the reports, the time interval of the hysterectomy ranged from as early as day 1 to as late as 10 weeks. Also, it was noticed that in cases where more than one technique was used to control hemorrhage, the necrosis was more or less complete as compared to cases where only one suture type was used. We have also published our case recently, but in our case, we had to sacrifice her ovaries also along with uterus due to complete uterovarian necrosis within 48 hours. As far as the factors attributing to uterine necrosis are concerned, suture tension plays a very important role, as the pressure produced by the compression sutures could cause progressive myometrial ischemic necrosis, which range from mild to partial to complete. And there are and there are case reports in literature where mild compression, mild ischemic necrosis has been noticed in the form of fundal grooves in during cesarean section in subsequent pregnancies. There have been case reports of partial myometrial necrosis noticed during cesarean section in subsequent pregnancies, and of course, complete necrosis, as could be seen in our case. Then stepwise uterine devascularization, if combined with tight compression sutures, may compromise the vascularity of the uterus all the more and increases the risk of ischemic necrosis. Lodi et al. Reported a case where they had combined compression sutures with balloon tamponade leading to complete necrosis. Wrong technique is equally important, as was seen in our case, because the primary surgeon, in an attempt to arrest hemorrhage, had tried to compress the uterus from all direction and had applied a transverse suture along with vertical suture. But unfortunately, that transverse suture acted like a tourniquet for the vessels in the infundibulopelvic and broad ligament and led to early uterine necrosis. Then in cases where the underlying septic foci and infectious process has already set in, the chances of necrosis become more, as this was also seen in our case because the decidual culture was more positive for MRSA. Then a lot has been talked about the role of suture material in causing necrosis. The potential risk of complications is more in cases with delayed and non-absorbable sutures. In fact, in most of the case reports of uterine necrosis, delayed absorbable sutures were used. D-Lynch initially introduced this technique with chromic catgut, but later on, when there were issues of infection with chromic catgut, he advocated the use of monofilament sutures like monocryl number 1, which loses 100% of its tensile strength by 21 days and leads to less complications. In fact, authors from Morocco have recently come up with this concept of removable brace sutures, where they remove these sutures 24 to 48 hours after the surgery to reduce the complications. But Mahajan et al. Argues that suture material probably has no effect, as damage would occur in the immediate post-operative period, as uterine tension is, the suture tension is instrumental in causing progressive ischemic necrosis, which was also seen in our case. So to conclude, I would emphasize that although the efficacy of these compression sutures is 72 to 90%, 92% as per the literature review, one should be aware of the potential complications and should follow up the patient either sonographically or by hysteroscopy. Of course, training and proper usage is mandatory to reduce the risk. Failures and complications should be reported so that a database can be created, and bigger prospective studies are needed to answer the questions about the best suture material and suture techniques. Thank you for patient hearing.
Yeah, thank you, Archana, for the wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Now I can invite our third speaker, Dr. Rashmi, and she will present the idiosyncrasies of COVID.
Thank you, ma'am, and good evening, everyone. So I'll be talking about some situations we faced during this COVID pandemic, where we were baffled by the behavior of this COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 virus. Since the onset of COVID pandemic, we have seen not only the humanitarian crisis, but the healthcare workers or the medical faculty has been on the forefront because of high morbidity and mortality associated with this virus. Accurate diagnosis is the keystone in management, not only management of the patients, but also to limit the spread of the disease to the healthcare workers as well as to in the community. And RT-PCR had been the gold standard in diagnosing of these cases. During the time when our facility was totally catering to the COVID patients, we encountered 23 cases of severe maternal outcome. Out of these cases, in the 5 cases which are highlighted in the red, in these 5 cases, we were really baffled by repeated RT-PCR report coming out to be negative. So I will be talking about these cases in short. See, all these cases, they were young females. Case 1 and case 5 were postnatal cases, while case 2, 3, and 4 were antenatal cases. All of them presented with acute onset of severe respiratory infections or the symptoms. And times in symptom range from 1 day to 7 days. And all of them were severely dyspneic at the time of admission or presentation, and SpO2, as we can see, it was very low. Now, in the case 1, because there was onset of these symptoms 1 day after normal delivery, which she delivered at outside some other hospital, such a sudden onset, so the possibility of pulmonary embolism was also kept as an alternative diagnosis. In the second case, which was an antenatal case, she was severely hypertensive, so the possibility of severe preeclampsia with pulmonary edema was also kept as a alternative diagnosis. Case 3 and 4 were basically having SARI presentation, and this case 5, it was referred from a secondary care hospital after 6 days of cesarean section. There, she had presented with severe preeclampsia with partial help in view of thrombocytopenia, and cesarean section was done for MSL. But after 3 days of cesarean section, she had received multiple transfusion around the time of cesarean section. But after 3 days of cesarean section, she developed features of respiratory symptoms. And then, though the RT-PCR report was negative on high suspicion of COVID, she was referred to us. As we can see, the initial reports of the blood investigations, hemoglobin was normal in all the cases, though it is not mentioned here. The TLC was normal, and in case 1 and 2, DLC was done, and relative lymphopenia was seen. SGOT, PT, these liver enzymes, they were mildly deranged in all the cases. And in case 4, who presented 7 days after the onset of symptoms, even the KFT was deranged. All the cases we did RT-PCR at the time of admission. They were admitted and managed in the ICU care. On the day of admission, RT-PCR was done and it was found to be negative in all the cases. The X-ray test was done and X-ray test was suggestive of COVID-associated pneumonia or bilateral viral pneumonitis in all the cases. They were managed on the line of COVID as they were highly suspects. They were given oxygen support either by HFNO or by BiPAP or CPAP. And then antibiotics were given, dexamethasone, low molecular weight heparin was started in all the cases. In case 1, as there was high suspicion of pulmonary embolism, the CCT was done on second day of admission. There, the radiologist reported no evidence of pulmonary embolism, and the CORAD score 3 was found, that is suggestive of the probable diagnosis of COVID was given. She improved on the therapy. Her hospital course was like she received oxygen for 5 days, and after that she was asymptomatic and she was discharged on 8th day. The case 2 was antenatal case presented with severe preeclampsia. She was also managed on the same line, and then labor was induced. She was also given Lasix and antihypertensive. Labor was induced, she delivered. But after that, like in cases of preeclampsia, she did not improve after delivery also. And she continued to need oxygen support for 7 days. X-ray was suggestive of COVID changes. And then she was discharged after 14 days and she had a normal delivery on day 2 of admission. Now, in both the first and second case, we did repeat RT-PCR because of high suspicion, but both the times RT-PCR came out to be negative. Similarly, in third case, who was a antenatal case at 23 weeks, again the RT-PCR twice was done, it was negative. Even the H1N was done and it was also found to be negative. Inflammatory markers were raised as they were raised in case 1 also. And X-ray was again suggestive. But during the course of stay, this patient continued to need oxygen from outside. And then what happened is that the oxygen requirement increased and she was intubated on day 4. And on 5th day, we lost this patient due to respiratory failure. This case 4 was hardly there with us for less than 1 day. And she was presented on 7th day of the onset of symptoms. And this patient did not improve. She was put on oxygen support and we lost this patient within 20 hours. Now this case 5, she remained with us for 24 days and she presented after 6 days of cesarean section. Now in this case, there was high suspicion of COVID. We sent the RT-PCR from nasopharyngeal samples for 4 times and every time it came out to be negative. The X-ray was highly suggestive. The inflammatory markers were very much raised. Even the H1N was done, it was negative. Later on, during the hospital stay in ICU, she continued to have fever and then at that time, blood culture came out to be positive for Klebsiella. The CCT was done on the 10th day of admission and then that was also highly suggestive of COVID. Later on, she developed AKI, she was intubated, she stayed with us for 14 days and we lost this patient also. Now I'll be just showing about the imaging pictures. The case 1, the CT scan was done. It showed bilateral ground glass opacities were seen with areas of consolidation and interlobular septal thickening was seen. The case 2, 3 and 4 had chest radiographs where multiple patches, irregular opacities were seen, which were mainly in the lower lobes and at the periphery, but otherwise they were involving all the lobes. I'm sorry for the poor quality of this picture, but that is what I could retrieve. In the 5th case, which we lost after 24 days, there were ill-defined alveolar opacities, mainly in the basal segments, and there were marked interlobar septal thickening was there, and focal pleural thickening. The findings were highly suggestive of the COVID. So common features in all these cases were, they were cases of SARI during the COVID pandemic. They were mildly deranged LFTs, lymphopenia, preeclampsia, raised inflammatory markers, highly suggestive of COVID. Chest imaging was suggestive of COVID, but repeated nasopharyngeal RT-PCR was negative for SARS-CoV-2. Now, if you look at the RT-PCR, though that remains the gold standard for SARS-CoV-2, it is a highly specific test, but across the studies, it has been seen that sensitivity is around 60 to 70%. First, RT-PCR can be from the upper respiratory tract. It can be negative in as high as around 50% or 46% of the cases. The reasons for false negative are multifold. It can be transportation, sampling, processing errors, manufacturer errors can be there, or the viral load is very low. And it also depends on the timing of testing in relation to symptom onset and also the sample collection sites. The shedding of virus is maximum around the time of symptom onset. And in the initial 2 to 3 days, the possibility of detecting the virus RNA is maximum. And after day 3, it was seen that the false negative rate increases. The possibility or the probability of detecting a positive virus is highest at the onset of symptom. After that, it is decreasing. If we look at the samples from different sites, the samples from the lower respiratory tract, that is bronchoalveolar lavage fluid, has the highest sensitivity for detection of SARS-CoV-2 virus. So accordingly, the recently guidelines have been issued that in case a patient is hospitalized and high suspicion is there and the initial sample is negative, repeat sampling, if possible, should be done from the lower tract. So this is what we also now retrospectively think, that maybe when the patients case 3 and case 5, when they were intubated, at that time maybe the lower respiratory tract samples could have been taken to clinch the diagnosis. Now, what was the role of imaging? Could we have made a confirmed diagnosis on imaging? Now, CT findings, as this pandemic has evolved, people have been doing CT scans, though it is not recommended for the diagnosis as such. The CT findings, which have been found to be more common in COVID pneumonia, are ground glass opacities, which are bilateral, subpleural, peripheral on basal and posterior lobes. They may be associated with consolidation. Crazy paving appearance has been described because of the inter and intralobular septal thickening, bronchovascular thickening, reverse halo signs, which is a sign of organizing pneumonia. These signs are not peculiar to the COVID pneumonia, but they are more common. These are just the radiological pictures of the CT scans. Their peripheral well-defined opacities are there, ground glass opacities. This is the crazy paving pattern. There may be focal vascular enlargement. There may be reverse halo sign, which is a sign of the resolving pneumonia. The changes, they occur in a study on the temporal changes in the CT scan as well as the RT-PCR positivity. It was seen that before the onset of RT-PCR, the changes or the ground glass opacities are seen in the lungs. And then it progresses to consolidation and the resolution of the symptoms. Here the symptoms started onset 2 days before RT-PCR positivity, and the resolution of the findings also occurred before the seroconversion in the RT-PCR testing. So these are the advantages of CT over RT-PCR. It can maybe early detecting, and it has may have higher sensitivity, but problem is with the specificity, as there is lot of overlap with the other findings. H1N1 pneumonia, as the time has passed, things have become more clear that if the centralized lesion, more consolidation is there, if the pneumonia, if the pleural effusion is associated, if there is cavitation is there, they are more suggestive of H1N1 pneumonia. So the findings have been described. There may be typical findings of COVID-19, and even the differentiation from pulmonary edema, like in our second case. So in the pulmonary edema, the ground glass appearance is there, opacities are there, but there is sparing of the subpleural region. So if the typical appearance is seen on CT scan, then there is high chance of the patient having RT-PCR positivity. The CORAD score, which is the score given on these findings given by Dutch Society, which was used in our hospital also. It is also found to be sensitive and specific for diagnosing COVID. Now, but CT scan may not be available everywhere. Cost factor is there. Exposure problems are also there. So the feasibility may not be there. So what is the role of plain radiograph? Radiographs have been recommended for first-line imaging modality. The similar findings are seen on radiograph, but we know that it is less sensitive than CT scan, and pleural effusion at least can be detected, which will suggest non-COVID etiology. So the reporting of X-ray chest is also suggested on the same basis. And if repeated X-ray tests are done, it may achieve the sensitivity as good as the CT scan. And most important is that if there are no findings on chest X-ray, then it can be false negative. So that one has to be careful about. And even the scoring has been given about on the basis of distribution of opacities, and it can predict the severity of the disease. The role of ultrasound is also coming up, and because easy availability, portability, these are the advantages with ultrasound also. And it can actually rule out pleural effusion, pneumothorax, and subpleural consolidation may be picked up on ultrasound. But it is a new entrant in the imaging modality for COVID-19. Recently, WHO published the Rapid Advice Guide recently, and it found that as per available evidence, CT chest has very high sensitivity, higher than RT-PCR, but the specificity remains a problem. The computer-aided diagnostic systems have been developed based on the CT findings in the positive patients, where the deep learning of machine is involved, and then it automatically can give the diagnosis of COVID, and it has been found to be successful. Another thing that we retrospectively thought that we could have done, at least in the patient who stayed for 24 days, we could have done the the antibody testing. Now, what are the recommendations? Though antibody response is not predictable and it is not as such diagnostic, but it can be a supportive diagnosis, especially in patients who present late, that is 9 to 14 days after the symptom onset, and CDC has issued the guidelines for that also. Now, so in these cases, we were baffled by the non-detection of RT-PCR, but on the other hand, in few cases, we were perplexed because of delayed seroconversion. These are two cases who were severe category antenatal cases, were admitted with SARI, managed here, delivered here, and after 8 days in first case and 10 days in second case, they were off oxygen. Now they were symptomatically relieved, but now the problem is that as per guideline, they were to be discharged after negative report. Now the nasopharyngeal samples were taken after 14 days and they were persistently positive. The first case went home on instruction for home isolation and her RT-PCR became negative on day 31. The second case could not go because the isolation facility was not there. So after being off oxygen on 10th day, she stayed with us for 34 days. Now, the evidence has come up that maximum shedding is in the first week of after symptom onset, and after that shedding decreases, but there can be prolonged shedding of virus in the respiratory secretions. The cases with severe illness, with comorbid conditions, or the immunocompromised have longer period of shedding may be there. But it has been seen that culturable or the potentially infective virus is not detected after 10 days in cases of mild to moderate COVID-19. And in cases of severe disease also, it is not detected after 20 days. Only in cases of severely immunocompromised, the culturable virus has been detected beyond 20 days and as long as 143 days. So recently, the CDC, at least CDC advises that except for severely immunocompromised patients, even in the severe disease, it is not required to wait for the negative report. So they can be isolated for 20 days. And the persistent positive, but in severe cases, persistent positive can be up to 12 weeks because of the residual viral debris. So key observations are that single RT-PCR can be false negative, high clinical suspicion, repeat the test in 24 to 48 hours, and lower respiratory samples, if possible, should be taken. Imaging plays a key role, and antibody testing can be done to support the diagnosis. And prolonged positivity, even in severe cases, does not mean infectivity. This pandemic is far from over, and there is no time to be complacent as of now. And to defeat this evolving idiosyncratic virus, we need to evolve with experience, learning, and innovation. I just wanted to highlight, as I was researching on this topic, I came across that artificial intelligence use has also come up in this situation, and are on IITians and IISc Bangalore. They have been developing the AI-based software tool for detection of COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you, Rashmi, for the exhaustive coverage of the subject and highlighting very pertinent points. It was one beautiful presentation. And I'll invite Dr. Kiran at the end for the comments, but we can go ahead with the next presentation. Dr. Richa Agarwal will give the comments and Preeti will present the case.
Good evening, everyone. Today we are going to discuss a very interesting case of an uncommon presentation of a common malady. This patient, 27-year-old female, resident of Delhi, P2L1, presented to us in gynae OPD with chief complaints of discharge per vaginum since last 1 year. It was an excessive, foul-smelling discharge, mixed type, associated with itching in perineum and backache, but there was no history of pain abdomen or dyspareunia or associated rash. There was no similar complaint in the partner. There was no history of postcoital or intermenstrual bleeding. Patient attained menarche at the age of 17 years, and she had regular cycles of 4 to 5 days, occurring at an interval of 30 to 32 days. There was no history of dysmenorrhea. She has been married for 7 years. It was a non-consanguineous marriage, and there was no history of multiple partners in patient or in husband. Her first childbirth was a preterm vaginal delivery at 7 months of gestation, and baby expired in NICU after 24 hours due to extreme prematurity and respiratory distress. Her second pregnancy was 3 years back. It was a full-term vaginal delivery, and baby is alive and healthy. Baby was exclusively breastfed and is immunized till date. There was no significant past or family history. On general physical examination, patient was of average build and nutrition, and her vitals were stable. Her systemic examination was also unremarkable. On examining her locally, her external genitalia appears healthy. There were no excoriation marks or rashes. On per speculum examination, her cervix was hypertrophied and it was smeared with thick, copious, foul-smelling mixed type of discharge. There was no visible growth. On per vaginal examination, cervix was soft and it bleeds on touch. Her uterus was retroverted, normal in size. Her bilateral fornices were free and they were slightly tender. So, clinical diagnosis of PID with cervicitis was made, and patient was given tablet doxycycline and metronidazole for 2 weeks, along with vaginal pessary for 6 days. And she was asked to report back to OPD after 2 weeks. When patient came, she had similar complaints. She was partially relieved of her symptoms in spite of complete course of antibiotic. Her per speculum examination now showed hypopid cervix with circumoral ectopy, an irregular surface and profuse discharge. Her pap smear was taken, but it reported as unsatisfactory due to inflammatory cells. Because of the bothersome complaints of discharge that patient was having and her suspicious cervical finding, we decided to go for colposcopy. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Richa Agarwal ma'am to further discuss this case.
Thank you, Preeti. Good evening, everyone. So till now, there was nothing unusual in this case. A lot of patients present to us in gynae OPD with PID and vaginal discharge. I had no niggle of doubt about this case, and we started colposcopy as usual and applied acetic acid. The moment we applied acetic acid, a known irritant, what did we find? Something popped out of cervix and started wriggling over the cervix. It was a worm. However, it was not willing to leave its abode, and we had to really struggle hard to take it out. It was trying to burrow itself into the cervix, and we tried rolling it out on the swab stick. Ultimately, the worm lost its footing, and we were fortunate enough to catch the worm completely. It was a small white worm, nearly 5 centimeters long, with a broad posterior end. You know us, we gynecologists, none of us could identify the worm. So we put it on a petri dish and sent it to the microbiology department for identification. It turned out to be Trichuris trichura. So we went back and revised our microbiology. Trichuris trichura is an intestinal helminth belonging to phyla Nematoda. It is also called whipworm because of their broad, short posterior end and a very long, narrow anterior end. They are widely distributed worldwide, and it is the second most common geohelminth. It is transmitted by fecal-oral route and generally resides in large intestine. Most of the infections are asymptomatic, and only 10% of infected subjects show symptoms of dysentery, anemia, malnutrition, growth retardation, and rectal prolapse. Microscopic examination of stool sample and identification of unembryonated eggs is the widely used method. There is usually no eosinophilia. On searching the literature, we found that helminthic infestation of genital tract is a known entity, though a rare one. However, most of the reported cases of genital helminthiasis are with pinworm infestation, that is, Antrobius vermicularis. Cases have been reported in literature involving vagina, cervix, uterus, ovary, and peritoneum. Patients with symptomatic disease have been reported to present with clinical features of vulvovaginitis, cervicitis, salpingitis, endometriosis, or generalized peritonitis, or even tubo-ovarian abscess. We could not find any case of trichuris, trichura in ectopic location in reproductive tract. This is the first case of trichuriasis in ectopic location. We all know the specific affinity of these worms to poor hygiene. Probably this worm came in search of new pastures and found one in the dirty diseased cervix smeared with phlegm of pus. All of these previously reported cases of worm infestation involve accidental finding of ova on cervical or vaginal smears, or are generally diagnosed as granulomas containing the parasite or ova with variable degree of necrosis and fibrosis in surgical or autopsy tissue specimens. Never ever a live worm has been reported from the genital tract. This is the first case where live worm has been retrieved from the genital tract, and that is why this case has been chosen for presentation. So coming back to the case, history was reviewed. There was no history of passage of worms in stool or perianal eating in the patient or family members. Perianal area was also checked for presence of any worms. Patient was put on tab-bendazole 100 milligrams BD for 3 days, followed by a repeat course after 2 weeks in consultation with microbiologist. Other family members were also dewormed. So we thought we found the solution of the problem and treated her well. But what is this? The patient appeared again in the OPD, not to say thank you, but to complain of a never-ending problem of vaginal discharge. So we again did her colposcopy and took her directed biopsy, despite no significant findings. And histopathology revealed tubercular granulomatous cervicitis. Various studies have been tried to find out the prevalence of co-infection of Mycobacterium tuberculosis with intestinal parasitic infestation, and found it to be varying between 10% to 33%. It has been suggested that helminthic infections can reactivate latent tuberculosis and aggravate the disease expression. So the patient was put on category 1 ATT. She responded well to treatment and has been disease-free for last 3 years. So to conclude, everything that wriggles on cervix is not a sperm. Thank you.
So it was very unusual, to take out the worm on a stick, and it was difficult. It was not getting, we could not hold it, and it was very wriggly feeling. So we thought we'll share our experience. Now, before I invite judges for the questions, I think Dr. Kiran will give expert comments regarding the COVID idiosyncrasies. Dr. Kiran, please.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Amita. I think I would like to first congratulate all the speakers for doing a wonderful job with all the presentations. Very interesting 2 cases and very rare, and something to learn from all these cases. Yes, as you have already said rightly that last year we were only managing COVID and COVID. I would just like to say that COVID pandemic, though, we feel that pandemic is showing signs of decline, but let me tell you that COVID is here to stay, and it's a very smart virus. It will come back by changing its strategies to survive. But as humans, I think we have to stay ahead of the virus, and so we should be trying out all those methods or strategies to diagnose, newer methods for diagnosis, because nothing is 100%, as we have seen in the cases which were presented by Rashmi. So maybe we'll have to look into the strategies to or newer methods of diagnosis and treatment, so that before the virus kills us, we should kill the virus. That is very important, and it's always better to be kind of forewarned, and so that we are forearmed. So I think that's all I would like to say. Rest of the things I think are open for discussion, and I'm sure people will have questions. And another one thing from which Dr. Bindya has presented, I think gynecological oncology cases are as important an emergency as an obstetric emergency during the COVID times. So that should not be neglected, and should become part of our strategies for management in any coming times, where I think we will be having many more pandemics. This is what I feel. So we should be ready and smart enough to be manage all these kind of emergencies in future. So thank you very much, and I think we should open the cases for discussion.
Yeah. So thank you, Kiran. And I think now it's the floor for the judges. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nita. The cases were very, very interesting. So I think we must be running short of time. So Dr. Bindia, so what do you think should be the strategy for GTB if next time again it is made a COVID hospital?
So the foremost strategy is that giving priority to other things also, apart from the COVID patients. Suppose I've given an example of COVID, so we should prioritize the other emergencies also. As I said, oncocare is an emergency. So we have a fully functioning hospital next to us in our same campus. So a strategy can be formulated that, that we can have some kind of combined effort, and so that the patients are not neglected and we can transfer onco services during those trying times. And also both our government hospitals, NCT hospitals, LNJP and GTB work completely COVID. So we should have the center of excellence should be there somewhere made that, where we can handle these kind
So
of.
I think we should have a very good referral system in place.
Yes.
Should have been done this time also.
Exactly.
Yeah. To the second speaker, is there any contraindication for B-Lynch? Supposing there is a PPROM, because this patient lost the uterus for the purpose that it was retained.
Yeah.
Is there anything like a contraindication for a B-Lynch?
The only the B-Lynch should only be applied if at the time of the surgery the surgeon compresses the uterus and the other surgeon can be at the vaginal end to observe the bleeding. If the manual compression of the uterus.
No, my question is.
Yeah, ma'am. So no, as such there has not been any contraindication. Contraindication has not been given by B. Lynch et al. In his case series paper. So as such, there is no contraindication.
One thing I
is
can
that
add,
the case selection should be proper. Those who can respond to compression sutures should be given compression sutures. Otherwise, it will lead to failure and the women will ultimately land up in hysterectomy.
Yeah. So what you said rightly is that the
very clear. It has been made very clear that transverse and vertical both sutures should never be put together. Either you choose one, what you want to do.
The idea of presentation was that only, that it was circumferential suture that had included the infundibulopelvic ligament also. So we had to sacrifice the ovaries as well, and probably so that one should be very vigilant.
Yeah.
Yes. I have a question, Dr. Suneja.
Yes, please, Dr. Deepti.
My question is to the regarding second case to Dr. Archana once again.
Yes, ma'am.
Now that this lady has both the ovaries was needed to be removed, have you started? Did you advise hormone replacement for her?
Yes, ma'am. We had planned that for her. We had planned for hormone replacement for her, but as I said in my presentation, also that lady lost to follow up. She did not follow up in our OPD. Though at the time of discharge, we specified all the things to her and we briefed her our plan also. But somehow she did not follow up. So we were very well thinking of starting it after having a consultation with our cardiologist also, because she was diagnosed to be a case of rheumatic heart disease with moderate MR.
Probably the cardiology people will not have much to say, because she is losing on the hormones that were normally being produced by her ovaries.
Yes,
and whatever HRT we give, even they are much less than what the body anyway produces. So this is going to be a problem for her.
We had very well planned it, but unfortunately she did not turn up during follow-up.
Yeah, we fully agree. It is a physiological dose.
Yes. And I would like to congratulate Dr. Bindia. It was a very nice analysis to know how well she has presented all the cases. May I ask Dr. Bindia, what was the cesarean rate? How many pregnant women did you deliver at your place, and what was your cesarean rate?
Ma'am, my presentation was oncology. I think Dr.
Oh, sorry, it's fourth person. Yeah, sorry, I got the thing wrong. The third presentation on mortality.
So during this time, I think around 250 deliveries of COVID patients were done in our hospital, and the cesarean were 100 cesareans were there.
250, yeah. So that's interesting because
Every chair actually, as you also must have seen, every patient becomes a big challenge when dealing with COVID.
because this is one thing that we noticed, that even though in the COVID era, the indication for cesarean has not been modified at all, but across the series that we see, including our own experience, the rate of cesarean has increased.
Yeah, definitely.
And do you have something about, did you see more of your preeclampsias in these series in your 250?
We saw more of preeclampsias because it can be the COVID related. Because of the COVID, there is a tendency to have, because it is a pro-inflammatory condition. So preeclampsia as such was high, and SGOT-PT were also high in most of the cases. So it generally, after some time, it resolves also in the mild cases. So actually, we used to keep on telling our residents, don't be very impatient to deliver these patients, because most of the times it resolves. So it is not as such preeclampsia per se, but it is the COVID associated inflammatory reaction in the body. So we saw that in most of the cases. I don't have exact figures, but in most of the cases it was there.
Yes, because so did we. Preeclampsia and hypertension were seen in a larger proportion of the COVID positive women.
With preeclampsia and SGOT-PT raised, so everyone was like, everyone used to think that it is, initially we used to think every patient is having cholestasis of pregnancy. Every patient is a preeclampsia. So actually we...
It could be part of a systemic inflammatory response.
Yeah, it is because of the multi-system inflammatory response.
Even GDM was very common. Every
GDM
patient had
also.
high blood sugar. It affected the pancreas also.
Yeah. So, in the later part, when we understood that COVID was mimicking this preeclampsia and IHCP, and so we then, started taking it a little lightly, in the sense that we waited for this period to kind of get over, and then the things would reverse also. Yeah.
I think I must congratulate GTB on beautiful cases and food for thought, and especially what Bindya said, though at Safdarjung we were a hybrid facility, but the onco patients were still neglected. And after 1 year now, we are getting those patients, advanced stage, or even if they are coming not in very advanced, long waiting lists, and they are really suffering. I think a policy needs to be made, because we are keeping on going to have these pandemics now. With this COVID may come again. So I think something needs to be done, that how these onco patients have to be tackled during this time. They have really suffered.
Yes, very right. Thank you. And it is not only gynec cancer patient. Radiologist was telling us that they are getting perforated tumors in surgery department also. The patients have been really neglected.
Am I audible? Good
Yes,
evening.
yes, Dr. Ashok, yes.
Yes. First of all, I appreciate the effort of GTB Hospital for excellent presentation and the message given by all these cases. And first case regarding services for cancer which were curtailed during COVID time. I just want to clarify here. You told that in January 21, you contacted the patient. I think it was a telephonic interview which you got all the information, or patient visited your hospital?
Telephonic contact. So we thought we reviewed, we actually revived our tumor boards because we were gradually coming.
No, it is a telephonic conversation. Na? So you should understand that there is always a limitation of getting the information on telephonic interview. So probably you have to look at in detail the information which you got, that how much was the information which was correct or right, because you have to really see if you want to quantify or justify the COVID which has affected the services, then you have to be very careful in evaluation, number one. Second is, yes, definitely COVID has provided the problem for the patients of cancer. But in our hospital also, we had performed in emergency situation, or where we felt that risk of malignancy or it is causing or hampering the life of the patient. We have operated 2 or 3 patients during this time, but not as a routine. Obviously, that was the limitation. So obviously, some or the authorities should have some policy in place to take care of these patients. So that is the message which is from this patient, from this case series. Regarding the second case of uterine necrosis, see, compression sutures have been prescribed by different people in different ways. There are different combinations have been prescribed, but yes, if you're not following the correct procedure, complication will occur, and probably that is the result of this event in this patient also. So only thing is one has to be careful while doing these suture or conservative management or any surgery, that correct steps and correct procedures are followed. Obviously, there are some complications which are known complications. But I just want to know from the presenter that you said that echo was done post-operatively and then it was found. See, the finding of MSMR should be, they should be able to find on clinical examination when patient presented at the first time. So there should be a suspicion at that time only, so that one is much more aware and careful in further management.
Yeah. And you know, surprisingly, even anesthetist did not pick it.
Yeah, everyone, yes, it was.
Everyone.
Tachycardia, sir, on presentation.
Yeah, and anesthesia was also given. And
so I think the murmur was missed. And she
Yes.
did not have any suggestive past history also. So
But
yeah,
murmur
that
was
should have been picked up even
missed,
at the secondary care hospital when the primary surgery was done, and we also missed. And later
yes,
on
so what I would like to emphasize that yes,
yeah, it's missed.
proper evaluation is mandatory, no shortcut whenever we
Yes,
see a
sir.
patient.
She probably came in emergency hours, so we were more focused on
No, there's no
uterus
explanation
and
for that. Archana, we don't
yeah.
justify. We have missed the diagnosis, we missed it. Yeah.
Thank you, madam. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment.
And Dr. Deepika, welcome back to Delhi.
It's really happy to be back. Nice to see all of you.
Yeah,
I think poor Richa Agarwal didn't get any questions. So my question was, didn't think of doing a colposcopy, biopsy? Did it look like a typical anything, like amoebic cervicitis does? Dr. Richa Agarwal?
Yes, ma'am. No, it didn't look like, it was basically cervix was very hypertrophied. It was not looking nice. Initially, it was smeared with purine discharge. So we gave her antibiotic. So it was just a hypertrophied cervix with circumoral erosion, which was later on seen after giving antibiotic course.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, when we applied acetic acid, we thought of doing a colposcopy and maybe a biopsy. But the moment we applied acetic acid, a worm popped
The
up.
worm came.
So our entire attention went on the worm. We retrieved it out and then completed the colposcopy. We thought we have found the cause of the nature of cervix. But when her symptoms were not resolved, then we took up the colposcopic procedure again, then took the biopsy.
So does the tuberculosis attract these worms or what?
Yeah, there have been studies where like it has been seen that this worm, basically there has been association. Studies have been done where they have taken the stool samples of the patients and studied the worms. So they have found that helminthiasis is more common in patients with tuberculosis. And that has been suggested maybe because of the decreased immunity and increased expression. Some amount of suppression also.
Okay. Very interesting.
Thank you, ma'am.
So do we have cases from other attendees? Are there any cases in the chat box? I don't know how, Dr. Deepika from Jackson Paul or Dr.
In the question answers, I think somebody has asked what was the fetal outcome in case 3, 4, 5 of Dr. Archana's series.
No, I think it must be Dr. Rashmi.
Yeah, Dr. Rashmi.
Rashmi
And case 3 was at 23. We lost the 3, 4, 5 cases, and case 3 and 4 were like undelivered. Case 3 was at 23 weeks, so we did not consider. Case 4 actually was at 30 weeks, but she hardly stayed with us. And case 5 had a cesarean section before the onset of symptoms, and that baby was all right. So baby was all right before she came to our hospital. So that baby did not have any problem. And in all these cases, the babies that went home live, the RT-PCR of babies were negative. So
Dr. Rashmi, was any neonate COVID positive? Did you check?
And there's another question.
No neonate was, now it's, in these cases, no neonate was COVID positive.
But somebody has asked that what is the vertical transmission rate?
Not much.
Yeah, not much.
Rashmi,
Actually,
I don't know the exact figure.
Nobody would know the exact rate. It is not much. In
most
fact,
of
in our series, only one.
Hardly any few, I think, case reports are there. So
we'll have to wait.
Yeah, in our hospital also, we did not find actually vertical.
I think there was one case which was positive.
One or two cases.
Yeah. It is a rare event.
So far.
So far. Yes, ma'am. The journey of learning and the experience goes on.
We had a very nice presentation evening this time. And I would like to, on behalf of AOGD, propose a vote of thanks. And I would like to thank Dr. Amita Suneja and her team GTB for such excellent cases. I mean, they were really amazing, very interesting. Even our PG students were amazed at the cases, the case collection. And I would like to congratulate Dr. Bindya Gupta for the excellent presentation on the impact of COVID. Basically, yes, our cancer patients have suffered. And Dr. Archana Chaudhary, a very interesting case of PPH followed by Lynch and then necrosis. We've never heard of it. And Dr. Rashmi Malik for the interesting obstetric cases with idiosyncrasies of SAC. And of course, Dr. Richa Agarwal, such an exceptional case. We've never heard of trichuris trichura wriggling over the cervix and never seen this. And its association with tuberculosis is yet another surprise. So it basically is a food for thought, like Dr. Achla said, and we have to keep keep reading.
And the last case, Abha was with Richa, take out the bomb, and she got so excited, Abha Sharma.
I tell you, it was it was a struggle to bring that worm out intact. And we had to, from one side, the worm was not wanting to come out. And from the other side, he wanted to. Good Ratsagashi. So that finally we could bring out this thing intact.
So you could actually gather an audience of more than 200. They were all glued to the screens. And even now, at the end of the thing, we still have 122 glued in. And
That's
I would
nice.
thank the judges of the day, Dr. Deepika Deka, Dr. Achla Batra, Dr. Ashok, and Dr. Deepti Goswami. Very nice question answer sessions also they've taken with the interesting discussions with them. And I would like to thank the audience, without whom our efforts would go in vain. And I would like to thank our AOGD team and the support staff, the support that we got from Jackson Pal, Dr. Deepika and her team. Thank you so much.
Thanks, madam, for the excellent presentation and a very fruitful meeting from GTB Hospital and UCMS.
Thank you so much for always giving us the opportunity. I thank all the speakers for doing a wonderful job. The faculty who have not presented, but they are behind the scene. And it is team UCMS and GTB. I thank the respected judges for taking out their time and making it very interactive. And of course, our colleagues I got so many messages from even Dr. Sunita Mittal has acknowledged and from outside Delhi, there are many participants. So that's very nice to hear. And the Jackson Pal for giving us the platform, Dr. Deepika, Dr. Vipin, and Amit also, he helps, behind the stage. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. On behalf of Jackson Pal, I would like to take this opportunity and thank all of you. Jackson Pal brings to you Doxipal DRL capsules containing doxycycline 100 mg with lactobacillus. Also Lycored Preg sachet and progesterone sustained release tablets as Diva Just SR 200 and 300. So my teammates, Dr. Vipin Tyagi and Mr. Amit Saxena, join me to thank all the esteemed faculty present here today, especially Dr. Amita Suneja and Dr. Mala Srivastava for giving us this opportunity repeatedly again and again. Thank you so much. And we hope to go a long way in knowledge sharing with the unending support of all the attendees. We hope to see you again in our next webinar this Sunday on adenomyosis and endometriosis. Thank you very much. Bye.